Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hi, I'm Samm Deighan, a writer and film historian, and I am here to discuss Karen Sheknazarov's 1991 film, The Assassin of the Tsar. And this is a really interesting example of what you might call late Soviet cinema. So obviously the Soviet Union came to an end at the very end of 1991, and so this is one of the very last Soviet films. And it did get some international attention because of its star, Malcolm McDowell. And interestingly, there are two versions of the film. One that's dubbed into English, where McDowell is speaking all of his dialogue, and another where he's dubbed over in Russian, and there's a Russian language version of the film. And that might seem like a strange choice, but I think it was fairly standard, especially earlier in the 20th century. In different European co-productions, there would often be somebody on hand to make a German language version and a French language version of the same film. But it's interesting because this is a very distinctly Russian film, distinctly late Soviet. And I think it does some really interesting things exploring history as mythology and myth-making, which you definitely see a lot of in this opening sequence here. And I think it also explores this idea of the fallibility or flexibility of things like memory and identity and trauma. And I think in some ways you could describe it as a straightforward drama film, a historical drama, at least in terms of its tone. But I think it does stranger and more interesting things than most conventional historical dramas. Partly because of McDowell's role where he plays these two characters, Timofeyev, who is this patient in an asylum, but also claims to be another person, possibly even two other people at the same time. And there are definitely some similarities between this film and Sheknazarov's absolutely wonderful Zero Grad, which was made a few years earlier in 1989, in the sense that both of them are concerned with distortions of history and the ways in which individuals have a relationship with historical events, whether those events affect them personally in an obvious way or not. And so, you have Timofeyev who's saying that actually he killed Tsar Alexander in 1881, and he also is the person who killed Tsar Nicholas in 1918. And I'll talk about the real historical events that come up off and on throughout this film. And Sheknazarov does something really interesting, which you see here in the opening, where we're sort of cutting back and forth between modern day and events from the past. And so I think in a way you could kind of see this as being a film about people who are haunted or traumatized by history, and maybe even possessed by it in a sort of supernatural sense. Because the interesting thing about Timofeyev is that he has this really uncanny knowledge of the way that both assassinations occurred. He knows all of these really intimate details that no one would have known, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But you also have this really sympathetic doctor, played by Oleg Yankovsky, who decides that Timofeyev's treatment has really stalled, and maybe one way to progress it, because I think they assume that he's schizophrenic, but he assumes that maybe one way to help with his treatment is to take him seriously, believe what he's saying, and also step into a character, which winds up going in a very strange direction. And so I think this idea of the rewriting of history and facts under totalitarian governments, specifically the Soviet Union, is something that's really, really helpful to consider when watching this film. I mean, it's certainly not unique to the Soviet Union. Most of the countries of Europe, if you look at films made in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, films about World War II, they tend to change dramatically by decade because you have this sort of mythologizing of history that happens, which skews events. And then you have later generations of directors and writers and artists who come along and say, actually, that's not how it happened at all. And so I think that is a big concern throughout Shekhnazarab's filmography, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. And you do get this sense that things like history and memory and identity are not fixed. They are subject to interpretation, which obviously can be a bit dangerous, which is something I'll talk more about later on. But I think here it takes on this really fascinating, uncanny quality. And that a little bit earlier, I said that this is a distinctly late Soviet film. And part of that is why? Because the Soviet Union has such a specific history with revealing and taking responsibility for their own historical events, particularly events of trauma and violence. And that is totally the theme of Assassin of the Tsar. And so you see things here that do represent factual moments in history, but are kind of these strange interpretations. And so I do think he looks a lot at the way that history, like history with a capital H, impacts not just nations, but towns, communities, and certainly individuals. And I think we tend to, as individuals living mundane daily lives for the most part, we tend to see history as being something separate. And I think what he does with a lot of his films, definitely Zero Grad, also definitely Assassin of the Tsar, is to sort of question how individuals are impacted by history and how these sort of great moments of revolution or violence or these atrocities, how they leave these sort of lingering wounds that show up quite literally in this film. And I should also mention that the Doctor and the Nicholas II character are played by Oleg Yankovsky, who was a really, really celebrated Soviet actor and a Russian actor. He's in a lot of more kind of psychological dramas and literary adaptations. And the Soviet Union had this practice of naming individuals a people's artist. It's sort of like a designation that's meant to show how important your work is to the nation, to the mission of the Soviet Union. And Yankovsky was one of the last people to be granted that designation in 1991. And Shekhnazarov often worked with artists of that stature, a lot of whom had these really rich theater backgrounds, much like Yankovsky. And he started really working in film in the late 60s in things like The Shield and the Sword, in these war movies. But like I said, was in so many literary adaptations, and he was part of this theater group throughout most of his career, and so would also do theatrical adaptations for television and things like that that were very well received. And he's great in this role because he comes across as being, as the doctor, really empathetic, and as Nicholas II, kind of lost in his own thoughts and lost in his own sense of tragedy, which I think sort of goes against what we actually know of Nicholas II, but I will talk more about that a lot later. And I should also say that Yankovsky will probably be familiar to Western fans of Russian films, like Tarkovsky's movies. He's in Mirror, he's in Nostalgia, and wound up doing things like running a film festival and directing his own movies. And he passed away in 2009 and comes from a family of actors and directors. And the older doctor, who was in charge of Timofeyev's case but has retired, is played by Armen Jigarkanyan, who is a really, really well-known, celebrated Soviet actor, Russian and Armenian actor, who also had this great background in Russian theater and was a stage actor throughout most of his life. And he should be recognizable to you if you are at all a fan of Russian or Soviet cinema. He's in hundreds of films and really, I think, just can do anything. He's in so many different genres. He helped run a theater in Moscow, and I think is well regarded as kind of one of the great actors of Soviet cinema and also more recent Russian cinema. And, he's somebody who taught at cinematography at the State Film School and just is really one of those towering figures. And he doesn't have a big role in this film, but it's great to see him as a contrast to Yankovsky's character, who is a little bit more empathetic, maybe, but definitely a little bit more intellectually curious. He's very concerned with trying to solve the problem of this patient. How can he help him get better? How can he treat him in any meaningful way? And I think that's sort of the main crux of the parts of the film that are set in the asylum in modern day. And I do just sort of want to point out the attendant here, played by Yuri Sherstnyov, who is a regular in some of Shekh-Nazarov's films. He's in Zerograd and was also in things like Hamilton and a 2000s adaptation of The Master and the Margarita, and is a nice sort of stable presence here who has a little bit of a sense of humor about the fact that Timofeyev just has a very strange history, and the staff of the asylum just kind of have to go with that. And before we get too much further, I do want to talk about Karen Shekh-Nazarov's career, because I think you really have to understand what his work is all about to make sense of what he's doing in The Assassin of the Tsar. And so, as I mentioned, he has a lot of films that really could only have been made in this very, very late Soviet period. He made a lot of musicals and comedies early on, but wound up, I think, because of this sort of glasnost period that I'll talk about more later, by the late 80s, he's able to explore different, more satirical things, maybe critical of Soviet society in a certain way. Zerograd, which I've mentioned, is definitely kind of this Kafkaesque, absurdist satire that he never would have been able to get away with even if he tried to make it in 1981. And, he has things like We Are From Jazz from 84, which is a musical comedy, but it explores this sort of relationship and this tension between American pop culture and Soviet culture, and how things like jazz and rock music can represent this sort of decadent capitalism, but they can also be a symbol of resistance and rebellion in a really interesting way. And he does have some early movies that look at that kind of dissent, like The Messenger Boy, about sort of aimless teenagers, from 87. As I said, Zero Grad is from 88. A bit after this, in 93, he made another absurdist comedy set in historical Russia, also concerned with the revolution, called Dreams. And that really seemed to be his angle in the 90s and the 2000s. But it's also really important to note that in 1998, he became Director General of Mosfilm. And I'm going to talk about them more in a second, but they are basically the most important production company in the Soviet Union. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they've maintained an importance not just at kind of cataloging and archiving and preserving Soviet cinema, but I think they are justifiably, one of the most important film studios of the 20th century. And so a lot of his work now is kind of going through the Mosfilm archive and catalog and having films restored, getting them international screenings and releases, and just sort of continuing that really important mission of preserving and celebrating Soviet and Russian cinema. And definitely some of the Mosfilm catalog has some incredibly, incredibly important films. And so I think it's great that they are getting a wider distribution thanks to these restorations and releases. But it's also interesting because if you look at Sheknazarov's films from the 80s and early 90s, they tend to be sort of critical of government. So you can really view his career as representing this really fascinating turning point. I mean, you could see it as both symbolic of and a comment on these really dramatic changes happening in Russia throughout the 80s and 90s in a way that really wouldn't have been possible even in the early 80s. And it's just such a fascinating way to capture that transition point on film. And in a way, I think The Assassin of the Tsar and some of his work looks at that kind of conflict, or that sort of potential for conflict. And it's also important to remember that this film was one of the very first to take a deep historical look at the assassination of Nicholas II and the Romanov family. Because, and again, as I said, this is something I will go into in great detail later. This assassination, not just of Nicholas II, but specifically of his family, was something that the Soviet Union really tried to cover up for decades. They admitted that he died a couple years after the fact, but didn't want to take responsibility. And so it's all very sort of hushed up and shadowy. Nobody even knew where their graves were for decades. And so once that starts to become public, kind of around this time, Shekhnazarov was pretty quick to make a film about it. And it's so fascinating to me that, he clearly recognized the importance of this event, which was a big part of what was happening with the revolution, even though that's not really mentioned in any obvious way in this film. Like, we don't see, historical reenactments of things that Lenin is doing, or Trotsky or Stalin. But it sort of lingers in the background the whole time, because that's why the Tsar and his family are executed, is because of the revolution and the decisions of the revolutionary committees. But instead of being a straightforward historical exploration of this assassination, it's filtered through this really interesting lens of insanity and madness and kind of modern day psychiatry. And so you do see these historical events, and we do have all these great, really gorgeous flashback sequences. But it seems like such a strange decision, but one that I think makes for a really fascinating film. And I do want to talk a little bit more about Mosfilm, actually. They, as I said, are one of the most important film studios of the 20th century, founded in 1924, and a lot of their mission from their very early years is directly related to what their mission is today, which is sort of as a propaganda arm of the Soviet Union. And they are by no means the only film studio that you could discuss as being propagandistic. Certainly Hollywood falls under that umbrella as well. But basically what they did was oversee film production for the Soviet Union. And over the decades, after Stalin's death, as things got a little more permissive, you see some incredibly fascinating films, things like Larissa Shepitko's Wings. You have epics like War and Peace, and the films of Tarkovsky, genre films like red westerns. And so I think the thousands of films that Mosfilm produced represent this really interesting range where on one hand, they are trying to always promote the mission and the values of the Soviet Union. And so they do have that propaganda angle. But on the other hand, as I was saying with Sheknazarov's career now as Director General, I think an important part of Mosfilm was to sort of show the Soviet Union and the world that there are really important artists and great art and culture that is bound up with this idea of Soviet communism. And they definitely sought an international audience at film festivals and things like that in the later decades. And I think that is very much a mission that Shekhnazarov is continuing now. And so after the Soviet Union ended, they continued on. They have different film studios within Mosfilm, sort of like little umbrella studios. And so it's partly still an active film studio and partly this sort of historical site that you can tour, which is really amazing. But as I said, so much of the more recent output, things like Assassin of the Tsar, even though I don't know that we can say 30 years is recent, but recent in the context of, from the beginning of the Soviet Union, it's interesting to see what is not allowed for such a long period of time and what became more possible when Shekhnazarov was directing. It's also incredible to me that he was able to rise so high in Mosfilm's ranks while making this kind of art. And as I keep saying, that wouldn't have been possible a decade beforehand. So you have an example, in this case, of a director working the system in a really fascinating way. He starts off making films in approved subgenres, as I talked about, with only mild traces of dissent, and then produces a full-on absurdist critique with something like Zero Grad. And I think Shekhnazarov is a really interesting example of someone who's able to really learn the studio system from the ground up, critique it, and change it in real time throughout his career, and then continue that career by going on to preserve and promote it. And not many directors have opportunities to do something like that. And certainly it's because of specific opportunities and talents that he had and still has. And I think also because he was coming up in Russian cinema at such a particular time and place. And I do think a film like The Assassin of the Tsar is an attempt to grapple with some of those issues in a way that feels maybe more personal and more emotional. And I think a lot of this is a reaction against the decades where you could only have films that fit under this umbrella of socialist realism. because a lot of the early leaders of the Soviet Union, like Lenin, definitely like Stalin, realized how influential cinema can be as a way of, spreading the Soviet Union's mission. But also, I think the question was, how can we create a cinema that goes against the sort of decadent capitalism of the West that I was talking about earlier? And so for decades, you could only make these films that showed, happy citizens living under these communist or at least Soviet values. And from decade to decade, you see that start to change. It definitely changed a lot under Khrushchev's reign. And so, as I mentioned, you start to see these films in the late 50s and into the 60s that look at different ways of pushing those boundaries. But it really wasn't until the 80s that, especially kind of later in the 80s, that you had an opportunity as a director to even explore wildly different genres and sort of darker, more film noir-like movies. I mean, one of the key films is Come and See from 1985, this World War II drama that is just absolutely harrowing. And, you have films that have more permissible sexual content and nudity, and things that look at the real horrors of what the Soviet Union was doing to its own citizens in its early years. The Cold Summer of 1953 is a good example of this, but I do think The Assassin of the Tsar fits into it as well, because in these flashback sequences, it's really very critical, without saying so in an overt way, is really critical of these executions, especially of Tsar Nicholas and his family. And I think around this point in the film is where Dr. Smirnov begins to kind of merge with Nicholas's character. And as I mentioned, he's decided to take Timofeyev's claims that he is this man who really existed, Yakov Yurovsky. He's taking these claims seriously as a means of exploring his issues, his disease. And so I think this is the part in the film where you kind of start questioning what exactly is going on. Is Timofeyev clever and he's just trying to get one over on these doctors and is manipulating them? Are they haunted? Is this an actual reincarnation? And in a strange way, this reminds me a little bit of a film called Audrey Rose, which was directed by Robert Wise. A lot of people sort of write it off as being a ripoff of The Exorcist, but what it's really about, and that definitely does show up in it, but it's about this man whose wife and daughter die in this horrible car accident, and he becomes convinced that his dead daughter has been reincarnated in another little girl who becomes troubled as she gets older and obviously has some sort of mental issue going on. Possibly it's reincarnation, possibly it's supernatural. But the way that Audrey Rose never really gives you a clear answer about what's going on is similar to The Assassin of the Tsar, where I think for most of the film, we just don't know, is this an actual reincarnation? What's happening here? I think if you want to look at it a little more literally through the lens of psychiatry, this thing called folie à deux is also a possible explanation. And folie à deux literally means madness of two. And it's defined as basically one person's mental disorder affecting more individuals, often people who are in a close-knit group, like family members or people in a romantic relationship. And so there's this idea that you can have shared mental disorders, shared delusions. And so you could definitely interpret the film that that's what's going on, except it doesn't really explain how Timofeyev has this really detailed knowledge at a time when that was just not available. I suppose he could certainly have heard it from someone, but it also doesn't explain the physical manifestations through wounds that happen off and on throughout the film, both to Timofeyev and to Dr. Smirnov, which is just fascinating. So I think if you're trying to look at this film in the context of Mosfilm and Soviet cinema, there are a number of questions you could ask. For example, if this isn't pro-Soviet propaganda, and it's also not a literal examination of contemporary life in late Soviet Russia, what is it? Is it an attempt to reckon with history? Maybe an attempt to reckon with what history does to both individuals and historical players? And by historical players, I mean figures we are able to recognize that have a large pivotal influence on historical events. And one thing that I think the film explicitly states is how Nicholas II has really been reduced to a symbolic figure who is not allowed to have dreams or aspirations and is sort of stuck on this track that the film tells you is destined to only end one way, which is in tragedy. And an interesting thing that it suggests is that Nicholas is aware that, like his grandfather, one day he'll be assassinated, and he sees the whole thing coming, which I don't really think tracks with actual historical events. So I do just want to talk about Nicholas II for a moment, because one thing that's really important to keep in mind, and as I said, though this goes largely unspoken, everything that we see happening here, at least all the flashback sequences, the assassination of Alexander in the 1880s, and the events of the Russian Revolution, particularly what occurred in 1918, are all the reason that these things are happening within the film. And I do think it's interesting that it really romanticizes Nicholas and makes him into a tragic figure without actually telling us much about his personality or his role or factual history. It almost looks at him as sort of this almost kind of poetic fragment, which I think is very intentional, because the official line throughout most of the Soviet Union's history is that Nicholas II was this tyrant. And so even though the Soviet Union didn't claim responsibility for most of its history in these deaths, they basically were saying, yes, he died. No, we weren't responsible. It was someone else. But he deserved it because, he was part of this family and had this legacy of just sort of being a tyrant and making bad decisions. And I think you do see some real historical parallels. So Nicholas II was born in 1868, died in 1918, as we see here, and was the last Tsar of Russia, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with the term now, but it's sort of more than a king, basically an emperor, and was part of the Romanov family, which had a 300-year rule of Russia beginning in the early 1600s. And so by the time you get to Nicholas II, he's in a really difficult situation, I think, because he just wasn't a particularly strong leader and relied very heavily on his advisors, prime ministers, and other people who were in his council. And he seemed to really struggle to make decisions without them. And I think the general consensus now is that his advisors often encouraged him to do the wrong thing, but his heart was in the right place. And so I do want to talk about his grandfather a little bit later because you see some parallels between the two of them. But Nicholas actually did make some reforms, even though, as I said, the Soviet Union talked about how tyrannical and sort of backwards he was. He did make some positive changes and tried to form new associations, particularly with France, to get some allies around Europe. But I think really was sort of stuck at this crossroads between being part of this traditional, extremely wealthy, extremely powerful family and feeling like things had to be done a certain way, while also recognizing that there was suffering and Russia wasn't maybe as advanced as he wanted it to be. And so, like I said, he does start to make some of these changes, but is very reluctant to give more power to parliament, to make things remotely more democratic. And so I think that inability to change and having all of these aristocratic conservative advisors really sort of made him look bad on a political level in his own country. Plus, things did not go well for Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and in World War I. And so a year before the assassination, in 1917, things were really, really bad. There were riots, there was violence, people basically hated him. And meanwhile, the Soviets and basically the Bolsheviks, I should say, and the left were rising in power. And so what he did was he decided to step down and to abdicate. And this, I think, really, really shocked people, but it also almost seems like a situation of being too little too late. And so he becomes this figurehead for failure and hatred. And I mean, rightly so. He's the Tsar on one hand. But I think the film really touches on that by showing this sort of hollow, tragic figure who was just kind of trapped in his own persona and can only see it ending one way. I think he also was blamed for a lot of violence that he wasn't directly responsible for. Like, there were all kinds of massacres, there was a lot of anti-Jewish violence, lots of riots. There was an attempted revolution in 1905 that was really, really violently suppressed. And so it's this series of events in the early years of the 1900s that lead up to his abdication, which definitely shocked people. And so I think this sort of lack of morale and economic issues and people starving and some very real suffering can be laid at his feet. But what I think Assassin of the Tsar nails so well is that once he abdicates, he and really his family just get kind of lost to history. And everyone sort of forgets about them. They were imprisoned, more or less, by the Russian provisional government. So what happens, and I will talk about this more a little bit later, but basically what happens is there's the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks take power, and the provisional government that's put in place just kind of doesn't know what to do with them. And I think if you follow the events of 1917 and 1918, because Lenin is pretty much heading up this governmental organizing committee, people have different ideas about things. Sometimes there are arguments. Sometimes it takes them a while to sort of figure out how things should go. And so I think in that confusion, the royal family does get kind of lost in the shuffle, and what starts out as them just being sort of under house arrest, like they're allowed to stay in their palace, they live according to the means that they're used to, they get to keep all their servants, they can still have some aristocratic guests, they still have their own guards. But gradually, and we see the sort of end of that in this film, all of that begins to change and things get worse and worse for them. And it seems to be the sort of situation, unlike the film Assassin of the Tsar, where it's like they could never possibly imagine that their execution was even possible. They just assumed that someone would come rescue them, or possibly the Bolsheviks would be overthrown and the Tsar could be returned to power. And I think a lot of aristocrats at the time didn't imagine that that's what was going to happen to them. And I think because of that, because they sort of get lost in the shuffle of the revolution, their assassination, their execution could become a state secret and remain that way for decades and decades. And if you dig into Soviet history at all, you definitely will find other instances of massacres like Babi Yar and things of that nature. You know, the starvation purges in Ukraine that Stalin is responsible for. All of these things become state secrets. You're not allowed to talk about them. Journalists and historians are not allowed to write about them unless they're outside the Soviet Union. But this manipulation of history and facts is something that I talked about a little bit earlier, but is such a characteristic of the Soviet government in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s and 80s. And so it certainly is not a product of communism, but of totalitarianism. And I do think there's this really frustrating misunderstanding of communism because of the way the Soviet Union quickly became a totalitarian government. And so the Romanovs are basically, after their assassination, basically lost to history until 1979, when the gravesite that we will see at the end of this film is discovered. But it even takes another 10 years, up until 1989, for the Soviet Union to acknowledge what happened. And a lot of this is the work of independent researchers, archaeologists, and people who basically were just out digging around of their own accord without any kind of academic or governmental backing. And so that's why it's so interesting that The Assassin of the Tsar comes out in 1991 before the Soviet Union has officially fallen. So it really, like I said earlier, is one of the first films made at that time to sort of acknowledge this is what happened. The government is in some way responsible. It's still sort of vague about whose direct authority is given to kill Nicholas and his family. But it really is difficult to wrap your brain around that it takes, 80 years for them to even get a proper burial, which didn't happen until 1998. And so I think one of the really fascinating things about Nicholas II that is almost unique to him in a way is the way that his reputation has changed over the course of a century. Because initially, as I said, for the first 60 or 70 years after his death, there's just this official line that he's a tyrant and was horrible to his own people, sent all of these soldiers to their deaths, which is ironic considering how many soldiers Stalin sent to their deaths, and just that he's this great persecutor who sort of deserved whatever came to him. And so I think there's been this project in more recent decades for historians both in Russia and outside, to have a more factual, balanced view of who he really was as a person. And so this film, of course, comes before any of that has happened. But I think it still does present this almost eerie kind of dream-like quality that's so different from the other historical dramas about the Romanovs, which definitely, like this, I'm not at all trying to suggest that Assassin of the Tsar is the very first film about them. And something that's so fascinating is that because their deaths were such a mystery and such a state secret for so long, I think the vacuum left in the wake of their murder allowed for some real wild speculation. And so you get all of these stories about how maybe Anastasia, Nicholas's daughter, survived. Maybe some of the other children survived. You have all these pretenders popping up. And so because Assassin of the Tsar is removed from that kind of speculation and engages in a totally different, almost more surreal type of speculation, it's such a singular film. It does throw in a few biographical details that I don't think you really see in other films. So other films often focus on Alexandra, the Empress, and her relationship with Rasputin, how she's really into astrology and folk magic, and all of these things that are sort of looked down on. Here, you don't see any of that. There's no real mention of it at all. And the family in general, I think, has basically no dialogue except for Alexandra, who has a few lines where she pretty much just complains about things. And the children are these kind of silent, almost figures moving about in what feels like Nicholas II's dream. I should also talk a little bit about Yakov Yurovsky, who, of course, Malcolm McDowell is playing in addition to Timofeyev, but Yurovsky was most definitely a real figure, and there's also a lot of speculation about him as well. So he's someone who came back to Russia, basically comes back during the failed 1905 revolution and joins the Bolsheviks. And so, by 1917, 1918, he's been a long time Bolshevik. He's a revolutionary fighter. Around 1917 or so, he joins the Cheka, which are the Soviet secret police. And of course, as we see in this film, winds up becoming the primary executioner of the Romanovs in July of 1918. And it's interesting because there really isn't a ton known about him other than his own record and some hearsay. But what you did get over the years is, so when he eventually talks about what happened, he gives this very specific story that is later countered by some of the other people involved who say, well, it sort of happened that way, but actually it's a little bit different. And the fact that in this film, Timofeyev doesn't just believe he's Yurovsky, he also believes he is the person who assassinated Alexander II, who is Nicholas's grandfather. And so this sort of folding together of time and history is really interesting, that he would come out and say, yes, I'm the reincarnation of Yurovsky, or that he is Yurovsky, but that he is also this other person. I do just want to talk about Alexander for a minute, because I think it sort of helps to understand these different periods of Russian history that are basically being folded together in this film. So Alexander II is an interesting, I would say maybe stronger, more colorful figure than Nicholas II, definitely less hated. But his assassination is also much messier and more confusing in sort of a different way.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where Terms and conditions apply.
So Alexander II was alive from 1818 to 1881, also Tsar until he was assassinated. And there are some parallels with Nicholas II. So namely, they both try to make some reforms, but Alexander is a much, much bolder reformer. And the main thing that he's remembered for is liberating the serfs and sort of ending the serfdom in 1861. So, 20 years before his assassination. And he does all kinds of other things, like he overhauls the legal and judicial systems. He makes punishment less terrifying. Corporal punishment goes away. And starts to give more power to communities and towns and local governments. He does change things a little bit for the nobility. So basically, overall, what he does is he kind of takes this enormous gulf between the aristocracy and the nobility of Russia and the serfs, and he makes the gulf a little bit more narrow so that the aristocracy aren't quite as all-powerful. And though there are still plenty of poor and starving people, serfdom is gone. Universities are on the rise. But also you have to remember in the 1850s, especially 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, you have leftist movements on the rise who are taking some really incredible violent action against conservative aristocracy. And so in 1866, there's an assassination attempt on his life, and that's something that he just had to deal with kind of frequently, were these leftist and anarchist groups who were just determined to kill him. And so I think in a way, they're kind of working against each other. So because Alexander is making all these pretty liberal, definitely some progressive reforms, he becomes more reluctant to make reforms when the assassination attempts start. And it's these revolutionary movements who are working against him. And I do think, as I said with the case of Nicholas II, in a way you could see it as being too little too late. People have been pushed to poverty and misery for generations, and they're just done with it. And so you have these anarchist groups who basically work together. The group who is responsible for his death is called Narodnaya Volya, the people's will. And so instead of it being this situation like with Nicholas II, where you have this kind of committee deciding on someone's death, and you have this sort of main figure orchestrating it and making it happen, there it was basically these young men with bombs who worked together. And partly this is possible because Alexander had a very sort of set schedule and would go and do the same thing every Sunday, where he would go to the military roll call. He would go in this bulletproof carriage surrounded by guards. And so basically what happened was Nikolai Rysakov was one of the Narodnaya Volya members. He threw a bomb at the carriage, which killed some people near the carriage, caused a lot of confusion. In the confusion, Alexander comes out, I think is horrified, but also annoyed and frustrated, and doesn't flee the scene immediately, and wants to stay around, take stock of the situation. And Rysakov, I think, has been arrested at this point, and Alexander wants to see who's responsible. So while all this is happening, another member of Narodnaya Volya, Ignacy Hernovichy, throws a bomb at the emperor as he's standing outside, causing all kinds of carnage, and injures the emperor so badly that he ultimately dies. There's also another bomber in the crowd who's ready to throw a third bomb in case the second one didn't work. And so I think these two situations where you have revolutionary groups working together as a group, conspiring to kill these different, parallel, and of course, related leaders. It's interesting that Shekhnazarov decided to put them both into this film, although aside from the very opening sequence, we don't really see much about Rysakov or Hernavicki or any of the sort of day-to-day movements of Alexander or his assassins. And so it's interesting that they're included because the focus here really is on the final days of Nicholas II. And I think so much of this is woven together and really, really hinges on the presence of Malcolm McDowell. So I do just want to talk about him for a minute because, he's one of the great actors of his generation, wonderful English actor who started off in some really incredible, especially in the 60s, started off in some really incredible, what I would maybe call art house film roles that were really, really challenging. Things like A Clockwork Orange, of course, from 1971, but he's also really well known for working with Lindsay Anderson, this leftist director, in this trilogy that includes If, which is from 1968 and was one of his first breakout performances, to Oh Lucky Man from 73, and Britannia Hospital in 1982. And I think as he ages, which of course we see here in 1991, as he ages, his career goes in a really interesting direction, where you see him in these kind of bigger budget art house productions. Of course, I also should mention Caligula from 79, which is one of the great performances of the 70s, of his career, of anyone's career. But he also, into the 80s and 90s, starts to act in some really interesting genre films. He gets typecast a little bit as a villain, which is why it's so interesting to see him here in this kind of lavish but very strange historical drama. He's in things like Paul Schrader's Cat People and one of the Star Trek films and Tank Girl, and continues to have a fascinating career in a mix of bigger budget dramas and genre films. And so in an interview, McDowell sort of talks about how he wound up here, which really is all because of Shekhnazarov. And, when you think about this film and how important it is in its inherent Russianness and the fact that I keep saying it's a distinctly late Soviet film, it seems really out of place that this British actor would be there to play this sort of double or even triple character. But apparently Shekhnazarov was working on the script and really just had McDowell in mind. According to McDowell in this interview, Shekhnazarov told him that when he was scripting, he had a picture of McDowell on the wall. He read the script, loved it, wanted to go to Russia to make a film, and said, it must be the most interesting place on the planet right now, which I do think that the end of the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991, 1992, a lot of people were fascinated to finally be able to travel there more unimpeded because it was a relatively unexplored territory. I think at that time, a lot of actors had not worked there, certainly American and English actors. And Shekhnazarov said that McDowell's performance in Caligula is what made him want to work with McDowell, but he never imagined that it would actually happen. And it's just funny to think of how well he works in this film, even though it would seem to be against type or illogical in some way. And Shekhnazarov talks about how for the film, one of their producers was British, Ben Brahms, who was able to get in touch with McDowell's agents. And through this kind of back and forth process, finally they were able to have a meeting in Geneva. And, you know, it all seemed, I think, sort of like it was never going to happen, but they met and they clicked, and McDowell was willing to work for far less than his usual fee, which I should point out he has a history of doing. He worked for Lindsay Anderson on things. So by the early 80s, he was able to draw, I think, pretty big money for his performances. But for something like Britannia Hospital, which Lindsay Anderson made in 1982, as I said, he either got like the base level fee, or I think maybe just worked for expenses. And so he's definitely the type of performer, and I really love this about him, that I think he doesn't just look for blockbusters that are going to make him a ton of money. He seems to be driven towards fascinating and often difficult performances. And so it really is no surprise to me that he said yes to this role and is so wonderful in it. And he's also one of those actors who I think is very willing in interviews and even in some commentary tracks, is willing to go really deep into his involvement in certain films. And so it's clear that a lot of these roles are important to him, and he loved working with some of these directors. And Shekhnazarov, I think, was asked, you know, what was it like to work with him? And he said, you know, of course it was a dream, as it is to work with actors of that caliber. And I think he does bring so much to the film, because this is definitely a movie that I think would be hard to market, especially to more mainstream American audiences, because, as I keep saying, you can't really describe this as a conventional historical drama because of the way it jumps through time and history. And because of the fact that these two different historical assassinations are filtered through this Timofeyev character, who we are told from the very opening of the film has schizophrenia, has some sort of mental illness where he is in this hospital. But it's interesting because there are certainly plenty of English language films that use a character with some sort of mental illness or in a mental hospital to explore different themes. Like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a really obvious example, but even something like Hamlet is an example of this. Oftentimes, those films will have characters do things that are really extreme, either manic behavior, or they're almost catatonic and depressed, or they exhibit sort of wildly different personalities, or they act out violently. But he doesn't do any of those things. Even though he's claiming to be two different people and to not really be Timofeyev at all, he maintains this relative calm throughout the film that I think makes it feel even more eerie than it otherwise would, because it prevents you from writing him off as just a crazy person. And it also allows you to buy into Dr. Smirnov's interest in going with his delusion and seeing what will happen if he plays into it, how far this could possibly go. And I think that gives it this kind of almost languid pace that might not be to everyone's taste, but it adds this very strange kind of melancholy emotional resonance that I think is so wonderful about the film. Another point that I think is really important to keep in mind is I keep talking about the way that this film sort of folds different events in history together. So, of course, you have the assassination of Alexander and the assassination of Nicholas. But Shekhnazarov clearly chose not to set this in the past and to set it in more contemporary times. So I think it's unavoidable to see this also as about the end of the Soviet Union, rather than solely being about these earlier revolutionary movements. And I don't even know that I see the end of the Soviet Union as being a revolutionary movement, more as being the result of this kind of inevitable series of reforms. And of course, that's the result of Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in the 80s and his policy of perestroika, which basically was meant to revive a failing economy. So you have things like perestroika and glasnost, these reforms that are meant to make the government basically less totalitarian, less scary, more open and transparent. And that's also why, as I said earlier, you have this real radical change happen in the mid-'80s, basically from 1985 on, where directors just have much more birth to explore themes that they never would have been able to before that. And that's all because of glasnost, which is meant to allow for more freedom of speech and sort of open the door for more criticism of Soviet policies. And I think, I've said this about Alexander and Nicholas, but I think it's also, unfortunately, this period that changes come, and there are some positive changes, but they're really coming too little too late in a lot of ways. And you have them following this period under Brezhnev in the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s, where there's really this kind of stagnation that happens. And it's funny because if you follow the Cold War in the late 40s, definitely in the 50s and early 60s, you get this sense, especially through art, through literature, and definitely through movies. You get this sense of the Soviet Union as this really closed off superpower that is a very real threat to the West and to democracy and things like that. But I think that really starts to fade in the late 60s and 70s. And that sort of sense of indomitable power kind of goes away as you have all these economic issues, government issues, people start to feel cheated and lied to. And that's why I think that change in the mid-'80s is so necessary. It's also why you get something like Sheknazarov's Zero Grad in 88, which is, as I said, a much more satirical look at Soviet life and at the way that people and communities, and especially government figures, think about and talk about history. Which, of course, brings us back around to Assassin of the Tsar, which asks constantly throughout the film, but never really answers these questions. It asks, what is the past? How does it haunt the present? How does it impact the government? How does it impact the nation? And how does it impact these individuals? And it's funny how these themes are so similar to Zero Grad, but almost from a totally different perspective. And I should mention that this film was co-written by Alexander Borodyansky, who worked with Shekhnazarov on a number of films, and much like Shekhnazarov, started in Mosfilm working on musicals and some comedies and more kind of lighthearted, quote-unquote acceptable movies before teaming up with Shekhnazarov for Zero Grad and for this film. And I think something that's really difficult to understand that, you really need to try to comprehend, to make sense of Shaknazarov's work in general, and this movie specifically, is the way that Russia in the Soviet Union, but Russia now as well, tends to mythologize itself. I feel like there's this understanding of Russian culture, the Russian nation, whether that's, Soviet or post-Soviet, as being in some way special or unique or superior. And you can definitely say that about other countries. I mean, you could talk about Japan in that sense as well. And definitely a lot of other major world powers at different times in their history have had kind of a similar self-mythologizing. But I think what's so fascinating about that type of almost myth-making by the use of art and history is that it's not something that ended in 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union, but has grown in a different way, and I think is definitely one of the remaining vestiges from Soviet totalitarianism, is this sense that, Russia is separate from the rest of Europe and separate from the rest of Asia, and it just has different governmental and social needs. It also has a history of government officials really kind of having control of the narrative. And what I mean by that is definitely layered. So on one hand, you have the historical narrative, which is literally history, the official version of events that come out in articles and books and is taught in history classes. And I think in a lot of ways, that idea of what the historical narrative is tied to things like control of news and media and communication and speech and the arts. All different ways that people use to tell stories, to express narratives about something. And the interesting counterexample to that is this understanding, at least in America, definitely during the years of the Cold War, but I would say to a large degree now as well. America and other democratic Western countries, there's this idea that those living under democracy have quote-unquote freedom, which really just means the freedom to buy things when you get down and analyze it. And certainly in the US, there's this same control over things like history and news and media and even individual identities in a way that I think a lot of American media and history and even films work to suppress, so that illusion of individual freedom is there and is shown to be of primary importance. Whereas something like Assassin of the Tsar and the way that it explores this kind of secret history of an assassination, but does so through this look at an individual who is haunted by history and haunted by his role as a leader. So I think it does this really nuanced exploration of what it means to be in a position of power and also what it means to have access to the truth of things. But you also do have to consider, and I think something that lurks in the background of this movie is any potential parallels between the revolution in 1917 and 1918 and what's going on in 1989 with this sort of revolutionary wave. Because the Soviet Union is not just Russia, it oversees all different countries and these Soviet satellite states. And so I think the fallout took such a long time because it was such a political juggernaut. And you do see that dealt with in this movie in some very strange ways, where I think it acknowledges that that kind of myth making is sort of fundamentally flawed or tragic, or something about it doesn't allow for the human to come through. And you start to see that, I think, more and more in this kind of last act of the film, where you see different events from different people's perspectives. This whole sequence with the eggs being brought to the room, you see that from Malcolm McDowell's perspective, but you also see it from the family's perspective. And so I think he is saying all these really interesting things about how subjective history and memory are, but it also does feel kind of reactionary and dangerous at some points. And the murkiness, where the film asks a lot of questions and, looks really beautiful and has these historical reenactments that were kind of revolutionary for the time, at least concerning this specific subject matter. I do kind of love the way that it fails to answer any of these questions and just leaves you with this very haunting sense of the ways in which historical trauma and political violence kind of reverberate throughout the decades and throughout different generations of families. And I think that's also something that it's helpful to know about Nicholas II that isn't really discussed in this film, which is this idea that it's not just impacting this one family or people in this one mental hospital. The pre-Soviet Russian Empire covered many, many countries, some of which didn't want to be involved, like Poland and Lithuania, who were constantly at odds with Russia occupying them. I think a similar situation can be said of Ukraine. And certainly that's, I think, what's so strange about, and like I said earlier, kind of poetic about this portrayal of Nicholas, is he seems so removed from the world and so separate from Russian history, from political movements, and from the revolution itself. And I think it's great that you just see kind of scenes of him alone with his family looking very out of time, so that when you see Dr. Smirnov in the present, he seems so out of place and almost physically ill about being in the modern world. At this bar briefly where people are dancing, he's sweating. And I think this sort of passing over of that possession or haunting or folie à deux or whatever you want to call it, he seems to be worse off than Malcolm McDowell's character or two characters in a way that is so fascinating. And in a way, with a film like this, what isn't shown and what isn't discussed is of equal importance to what is shown and what is discussed. And something I haven't really pointed out is just how much of this takes place in voiceover, where you're hearing different characters give their interpretation of events. And sometimes we're watching those events unfold in a way that mirrors with the narration. And other times the narration feels kind of more personal or maybe even more speculative. And so the fact that he doesn't show any of the Russian Revolution going on, none of the protests in the past, aside from there's one sequence where you're looking through Nicholas II's eyes and you see his grandfather, Alexander, lying on a couch covered in blood. That's really the only time that we see evidence of protests because, again, of how I mentioned earlier, how Alexander is killed. But really, even in these modern day scenes, you don't see any of the protests that were going on in 89, 90, 91, even a little bit earlier than that, which started with student demonstrations in 85 and 86 in various parts of the Soviet Union, and moved on to so many places by the late 80s. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Germany. And so it's sort of like this wave that starts in roughly 88 and leads to the total downfall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a couple months after this film. And you so rarely see historical dramas deal with this kind of personal speculation. So instead of doing the easy thing and showing us crowds of angry protesters, we go really, really deep into the internal worlds of these characters, especially Malcolm McDowell's various characters, who possibly, at least, in a logical, explanatory way, imagine themselves to be key players in history. And it's funny because I don't think Yurovsky is really ever thought of as being a key player in the Russian Revolution. He is really just somebody who happened to be in a specific place at a specific time, who carried out orders that he was given and really sort of went whole hog on them. So it is an interesting way to see how such a wild time in history is transformed into this more personal, more poetic, and as I keep saying, eerie interpretation of historical events. And there is also this voyeuristic quality where we jump back and forth in these flashback scenes, and the flashback scenes take up most of the final act of the film. We jump back and forth between Nicholas's perspective and Yurovsky's perspective. And so in a weird way, he almost feels like a voyeur of Nicholas and of his family life, which at this point has really become drastically different than what they were used to, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. And so I do think that in the case of this film, you really look at these events surrounding the Romanov family in so many different ways, because the actual assassination of Nicholas II is the death knell, basically, of an era, and is, one of the key components of the Russian Revolution in certain ways, but also the way that it shows up in this film. It becomes the symbolic end of another era, that era being the Soviet Union itself. So in this really fascinating way, this film uses this massacre, this horrific event, as representing both the birth and death of the Soviet Union. And that's, I think, just such a fascinating way to explore history through film. And I think if you are a fan of more mainstream cinema, you're used to seeing what comes across as realism or approximations of realism, which I think is not true for a lot of different national cinemas, is they're not always striving for films to imitate life. Definitely earlier, I brought up this concept of socialist realism, which is what the Soviet Union expected their filmmakers to create movies in. And socialist realism is funny because it's not realism at all. It's this very propagandistic, specific view of Soviet life that's optimistic and says that if you work hard and you follow these values and you're a good communist, that you will fundamentally be happy and you'll be able to rise above the suffering in your life. And of course, as I said, that changes with different decades, which show things like the hardships of war and poverty and things of that nature. But it's interesting to see the assassination of Nicholas II take on such a symbolic function here, because on one hand, you have this interesting, really detailed depiction of a historical event that, whether or not it's literally accurate, it attempts to closely follow accounts of the time, but it also is using them in a symbolic way. And so one of the things that Shekhnazarov talked about in an interview is that at the time this film was made, they were still learning things about this crime from decades ago. He said, "At the time, we didn't know much about the death of the Tsar's family. When the 90s came, we began to get some information, and I was very excited about the idea of a movie. There are some very dramatic moments in world history, and it is one of them, the moment that will always agitate the artist's souls. But we were the first who've done something of it," meaning to take this really pivotal moment and make a film out of it. And it's just so fascinating the way it kind of refracts how this one event shaped Russian history and continued to shape it over the decades. And I think in a more literal, realist, historical aspect, I think it's particularly interesting the way that in this third act of the film, but definitely earlier as well, they make an attempt to do this detailed creation of these historical settings. And where they are now and where they have been, at least in these Nicholas II flashback sequences, is in this place called the Apatiev house, which is where the family was taken and imprisoned and where they were murdered, which is an event that we are about to see unfold. And the fact that they were killed in a room of the house by this firing squad, it's just this chilling scene that you know is coming, and it feels very inevitable. And as I said earlier, I think it even feels inevitable to Nicholas's character, at least the version of him that's presented in this film. And I do want to mention that the gorgeous cinematography here is from Nikolai Nemelyev, who did work with Shekhnazarov. And I actually also just want to kind of give a little bit of a factual rundown of what happened to the family, because I think it's helpful to understand how they got into this situation, which when you think about this, royal family, this basically emperor who abdicates and then within a year or two is put under house arrest and imprisoned and murdered in the dark of night in a far region of the country, basically with none of his allies knowing what happened to him, it seems incredible. And I think that component is carried out so well in the film. I keep talking about how poetic and eerie and melancholy it is. And this family just feels so isolated, and despite all their wealth and power, they were. And I think they were especially isolated because of that wealth and that power and the tradition of their family as being this ruling dynasty. It separates them from regular people, which I think is something that this film comments on really well, but in a really subtle way. It's sort of they're victims of that imperialist system just as much as all the people who were killed by them, basically. So what happens with Nicholas II is, as I said earlier, he decides to abdicate because he's incredibly unpopular. Things in the country are really not going well. So when he abdicates for himself and for his heir, basically saying, our family is out of this, we're not ruling the country anymore. And Alexei, as I think most people know, had hemophilia, was very ill off and on throughout his life. Definitely during this period, there's sort of a delay as the family is moved throughout the country because Alexei is sick, and the whole argument about why Alexandra got involved with Rasputin is because she was desperate to find someone to cure her son, who is the only heir. So when Nicholas II abdicates, he also abdicates for Alexei. But I think the fear, which seems quite valid, is this idea that someone, some sort of loyalist or monarchist or quote-unquote white Russian, would come along and take one of the family members and use them as a figurehead and find a way to reinstate them. And so the provisional government really doesn't know what to do with them and basically says, okay, after you abdicate, you're going to be under house arrest in the Alexander Palace, which was one of their homes. And so at first, in 1917, their lives haven't really changed all that much. They have limited access to leaving the palace, which I have to assume they didn't really do that much anyway, unless they were, traveling to some other palace. But so they're allowed to keep on retainers and servants and things like that. But then the July days hit. And the July days are this period in 1917 where the revolution really starts to pop off. And it's violent and scary, and there are these outbreaks all around the countryside. And so the provisional government says, okay, we're going to move them out of the Alexander Palace for safety reasons. And I think some of that is valid. It's also hard to say whether or not that was just an excuse. But so in October, the Bolsheviks take power from the provisional government. And the provisional government is definitely much more conservative than the Bolsheviks. And I think the real surprising and kind of tragic in hindsight thing is Nicholas doesn't really seem to care that any of this is happening. He's just had a reputation for being very close with his family. And so I think just living this wealthy lifestyle, trapped in this palace with his family, he just got even more disconnected from the outside. But things start to change in 1918. There were more restrictions placed on the family. The guards became less respectful and maybe even more abusive, and the government cut back their allowance, so their lifestyle changed. And the horrible thing about all of this, especially this death sequence here at the end where you watch these children being killed, is they believed that there were different plots in motion to rescue them, which was not the case. And it seemed like basically most of Europe, most of the countries who maybe would have been their allies, totally forgot about them and really only cared about Nicholas and his family when they could be used as political pawns. So they're relocated to this Apadiev house in Yekaterinburg, which is how they come across Yurovsky, because that is where he's working for the Bolsheviks. They're imprisoned in this house, which I don't think when they initially went there, the plan was to kill them, but it seemed to sort of quickly become the plan, and it was called the House of Special Purpose. And at that point, they're just further and further restricted. They're not allowed to leave rooms. Some of their servants are sent away. And you do see at their death sequence a few minutes ago how some of the servants are actually killed with them. And so what happens is Yurovsky orders the family and the surviving, or I should say remaining members of their household into this room in the basement and basically just opens fire on them, kills some of them immediately. But as you kind of see or can get a sense of, they really focused on Nicholas and Alexei as making sure they were dead immediately, as, the former Tsar and his heir. But you hear different accounts of how some of them weren't dead yet, and there's just this sort of horrifying move to go through the room and find who's injured and needs to be killed. And so the records sort of show that this order came from some of the Bolsheviks in Moscow, and Trotsky, who was not there at the time, wrote in his diary that Lenin supported this decision and decided that it was the best thing to do at the time because of their symbolic value. And they managed to keep this quiet for a shocking amount of time, partly because they're so far away from everything, and there's such a small number of people keeping watch over them. Of course, Yurovsky is in charge of the whole thing and tries to keep it as quiet as possible, which is why we have this sequence where they're taken to this field in the forest. Their bodies are burned and disfigured so that they won't be able to be identified. And I think some of the speculation is either disfigured with acid or with bombs and grenades used to blow up parts of their bodies. It really is just horrifying to think about. But it's also interesting because I think there's still speculation about really what happened and who's responsible for different things. Yurovsky, I believe, took responsibility for being the one who actually killed Nicholas, and from maybe an early Soviet or Bolshevik perspective, I think he was trying to make himself out as a hero, perhaps. But later on, some of the guards who were there kind of came out and said, things didn't happen exactly the way that he said they did. But what's particularly, I think, effective about this is they did eventually, I think a couple months later, come out and say, yes, Nicholas is dead, but they were very vague about how he died or who killed him. They said that they weren't responsible. And I think Soviet leadership definitely has a historical reputation for altering and distorting facts and history. And of course, they did that as well with the deaths of the Romanovs. And so there are all these varying claims. They stir up rumors and misinformation. They blame radical revolutionaries who I think are supposed to be anarchists, maybe more left-wing than the Bolsheviks. But as for the rest of the family members, for years, I think for at least 4 or 5 years, they claimed that they were still alive, they didn't know where they were, and that the family had gone into hiding. And so what winds up happening is almost a decade later, they're called out by a journalist who caught wind of the fact that they were killed, their bodies were destroyed, and it was Lenin and this Soviet council that basically organized the whole thing. And it really is interesting to think that so many of the attempts to uncover what really happened were by journalists or amateurs who really were just trying to dig. And that's how the burial site is discovered in 1979. And as I said earlier, the Soviet Union, even after the burial site was discovered, said, no, that's not what happened. That's not the royal family. They were eventually forced to acknowledge it, but not until 1989, of course, pretty much right before this film was made. And DNA testing and forensic analysis was used to be sure that, yes, it was the family, or at least part of the family. And it wasn't until over a decade, or I think about a decade later, that 2 of the other children, including Alexei, were found in a grave nearby. So it really is this long legacy that just happens to kind of parallel the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. And this is just such a fascinating first attempt at a sort of late Soviet reckoning with this one act of violence. And of course, as I keep saying, it's really about the 2 assassinations. But this one is much more the focus of the film. And so this look at how this act of violence really impacts history and a nation and these individuals, so much of it is sort of left up to your own interpretation. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this, is the way in which it doesn't really come out and tell you what to think. It doesn't literally come out and say, Lenin was wrong for ordering this, and Yurovsky was wrong for organizing it and carrying it out. And there isn't really blame placed. The blame is almost more placed on history and kind of these social structures that put people like Nicholas into those impossible positions. And as I said earlier, the Soviet government really went out of their way to spin him as this awful tyrant. But I think more recent evaluations show him as just a person who was trying to do the right thing, but was really indecisive and probably just wanted a life at home with his family, which is sort of similar to the circumstances of the French Revolution, where you have these wealthy people who have lived basically in this dynasty for centuries, and they just want to relax and be rich and don't want to be bothered with the process of governing. And it goes really, really badly in both instances. And so I think especially for people who are more used to straightforward historical dramas, like Hollywood films or other mainstream commercial dramas, I think this is such a fascinating counterexample of a way that you can use historical accuracy, or at least real historical events, and take a look at some of the symbolism and the subtext that these things have come to represent. Because as I said earlier on, the way that history is manipulated over time by different individuals, by governments, it's something that is never going to change, and that I think people have become more and more aware of. But with this film, I think it pretty much comes out and tells you from the very opening frames that the way people define themselves and knit themselves together as communities and as nations is through storytelling, through myth making. And that's exactly what is shown going on here, in a way where they don't try to explain it, they don't try to justify it, they don't really even tell you what's going on in any conclusive way. Like, is this guy really Yurovsky? And if not, how does he have such detailed knowledge? And how does he know all these things? And why is he physically affected by the same wounds and the same ailments that the real Yurovsky was allegedly afflicted by? And that's also why I think it's so important that a lot of this film plays out with voiceover narration, because Shekhnazarov is constantly reminding you that this is about storytelling and about how we turn history into a story that sometimes we use for propaganda purposes, or sometimes to define who we are as communities and individuals. But I think he's also astutely saying that historical traumas, even if it's this assassination that at the time people believed was carried out for the right reasons and for the sort of good of the country and the good of the people, how those wounds have a lasting effect that carries over decades and sometimes even over centuries. And so the way that it ends here, where it's just sort of business as usual, although we do get this sort of flash to him dying as Yurovsky, but it's sort of business as usual in the asylum, and it seems like nothing has fundamentally changed, either for Timofeyev or really for any of the characters involved. And so I love that it doesn't try to explain anything away. It just leaves you with this unsettling sense of melancholy and tragedy. And I'm really glad that films like Assassin of the Tsar are going through this restoration process by Mosfilm, because so many of these have been inaccessible for people to watch in English language versions, Or even a film like this, it just was hard to find if you didn't manage to catch it in some sort of original run. And so I hope this will introduce a whole new generation of cinema fans to Sheknazarov's work and to the importance of these Mosfilm restorations.
Hello and welcome to Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys. My name is Hunter. In this podcast, I'll be joined by a different guest each week to discuss a classic Western movie or TV show. I've been a fan of classic Westerns for as long as I can remember, and in recent years, they've become very nostalgic for me. I love the aesthetic, the tropes, and I love seeing different filmmakers' takes on them. At their best, they're incredibly entertaining, rewatchable, and some of my all-time favorite movies are Westerns. We'll mostly focus on Western movies made in Hollywood, but we'll also be covering spaghetti Westerns, and one thing I'm very excited to get into are Western TV shows. I've got some amazing guests coming on the show, film professors, historians, and podcasters, and Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys is part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, and many guests on the show will be from other shows on the network. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description